Picture a French chateau rising from English countryside. Waddesdon Manor sits on a hilltop in Buckinghamshire, its cream-colored stone glowing against green fields like something transplanted from the Loire Valley. This is the Rothschild estate, one of the most extraordinary examples of old money architecture ever constructed on British soil. And today, we dive into the dark story behind the Rothschilds Waddesdon Manor Old Money Mansion. How does one Jewish family force the English aristocracy to accept them as equals? What machinery operated behind those Renaissance facades to maintain an illusion of effortless belonging? Waddesdon Manor represents more than architectural achievement. It's evidence. A monument to the bargain struck between wealth and acceptance, between outsiders and establishment, between the promise of assimilation and the reality that some boundaries never fully dissolve. But the house remembers what the photographs exclude: the desperation behind the beauty, the cost of proving worth, and the mathematics that eventually failed even those who seemed most secure. If you enjoy deep explorations into the forgotten mansions and families that shaped the most extravagant era, please support this documentary by liking and subscribing. And if you have your own insights or stories about these estates, I'd love to read them. Now, let's step inside. Walk through Waddesdon's entrance hall in 2024, and your senses encounter careful curation. Gilded ceilings reflect light from chandeliers, whose crystals catch afternoon sun streaming through tall windows. Sevres porcelain sits behind velvet ropes, each piece worth more than most visitors earn annually. Renaissance portraits gaze down from walls, their subjects long dead, but their clothing and jewelry suggesting wealth that transcended mortality. Tour guides speak in hushed, reverent tones. Visitors move slowly, phones raised, capturing images they'll post with captions about old-world elegance and timeless beauty. The air smells faintly of furniture, polish, and preserved textiles. Everything suggests permanence, taste, belonging that extends back centuries. This is the story they want you to absorb. Now rewind that same hall through time. November 1940. The chandeliers are dark, electricity rationed for war effort. Heavy blackout curtains smother every window. Tape crosses the glass in X patterns, crude shields against blast waves from German bombers targeting nearby cities. Outside, searchlights rake Buckinghamshire sky. Inside, the entrance hall stands cold, empty. The portraits watch over rooms with no guests. Waddesdon has become a shell during wartime, the family largely absent. Staff reduced to skeleton crews maintaining a structure whose purpose, entertaining, impressing, proving belonging, has evaporated in crisis. But the basement strongrooms contain something remarkable: art treasures from London's National Gallery, packed in crates and wrapped in protective blankets, hiding from the Blitz in secret storage. Rembrandt, Gainsborough, Constable, paintings the British government trusted to this house when even official vaults felt vulnerable. The same rooms, different worlds. That contrast reveals what Waddesdon was really built to defend. Not just status or luxury, but something more fragile: the hope that wealth could construct walls high enough to keep out hatred that had followed this family across borders for centuries. The belief that a perfect chateau on an English hill could finally provide what their banking empire never could: the right to simply exist without justifying their presence. The question haunting every gilded surface: what do you build when you know, deep in your bones, that no fortress offers permanent safety, when the ground beneath your palace has always been contested? Ferdinand James Anselm de Rothschild enters the world in Paris, 1839, marked immediately as insufficient. Sickly from birth, pale thin, the kind of child wealthy families watch over with private physicians, expensive tonics, whispered consultations in corridors that assume he's listening, but pretend he isn't. His father Anselm runs the Rothschild Bank in Frankfurt and Vienna, one node in a family network spanning Europe. An uncle controls the Paris branch. Another holds London. The dynasty moves gold and government bonds through blood ties and encrypted correspondence, financing railways and wars, propping up monarchies and destabilizing ones that threaten family interests. Ferdinand's brothers are groomed for this empire. Strong, confident boys who sit through dinners with ministers, who remember which cousin backed which railway, who understand instinctively how power operates when it's denominated in both currency and connection. Ferdinand is kept apart, protected, the fragile one. Being weak in a dynasty built on strength teaches lessons the healthy never learn. You're always one illness away from irrelevance. Your worth feels conditional. You must prove yourself through different means, since you'll never match your brother's robust confidence. And you learn something else. When the real world feels dangerous, you build inner worlds you can control. Ferdinand is sent to England for his health, the damp climate supposedly kinder to his lungs than harsh continental winters. An odd prescription that suggests how desperately families in fear will grasp at any remedy offering hope. He arrives as a teenager, shy, foreign, his English uncertain, his role in the family's machinery undefined. Then he meets Evelina. His cousin, the Rothschilds marry within the family frequently, keeping the banking network tight, inheritances concentrated, secrets internal. She's 18 when they wed in 1865. He's 26. This isn't merely calculated alliance. Surviving letters hint at genuine affection, shared jokes, mutual anxieties, plans for a life together that feels possible despite Ferdinand's fragile health and uncertain position. Evelina dies in childbirth 18 months later. The baby dies as well. Here the historical record falls nearly silent. Victorian men, especially Rothschild men expected to steady empires and entertain royalty, don't write openly about grief. But Ferdinand's choices speak clearly. He steps away from the family bank, loosens ties to Vienna and Frankfurt, to the financial machinery his brothers navigate effortlessly, settles permanently in England, becoming the exile who chooses his isolation rather than having it imposed. And he begins collecting with intensity that suggests replacing human connection with objects that can't abandon him. Porcelain, paintings, furniture, manuscripts, items he can catalog, control, arrange into precise order. By his early 30s, Ferdinand has assembled collections rivaling public institutions. His London residence overflows. Rooms become storage. Staircases narrow from crated acquisitions. Every surface transforms into display space. But collections like this demand more than walls. They demand stages. Settings that tell visitors how important these objects are, how sophisticated their owner is, how much his taste deserves respect regardless of his family's continental origins and Jewish identity. They demand a palace. The decision to build Waddesdon emerges in the early 1870s. Ferdinand will later write that he wanted a seat in the country worthy of my name and position, polite phrasing that conceals clearer psychology. He's designing a place where he can nail beauty into permanence, where he can force English aristocracy, who still view Rothschilds as foreign upstarts, Jewish, too rich too quickly, to acknowledge that this banking family understands elegance as deeply as any ancient lineage. He is constructing a monument to control in a life that has taught him how little can truly be controlled. The wound driving Ferdinand doesn't show in photographs. No visible scars, no dramatic accident. But it marks every decision. The choice of French Renaissance style, the impractical hilltop site, the relentless insistence on perfection, the weekend house parties that will eventually draw the Prince of Wales himself to sleep in guest rooms and smoke cigars in Ferdinand's library. All of it engineered to prove one thing: a Rothschild can belong. But first, he needs to build the proof. 1874. Ferdinand purchases land in Buckinghamshire, approximately 2,700 acres of rolling farmland, dominated by a bare hilltop called Lodge Hill. Location seems actively hostile to construction. The summit rises 650 feet above sea level, exposed to weather from all directions. No natural water source. No existing access roads capable of supporting construction traffic. Soil composition unsuitable for supporting massive stone structures without extensive foundation work. Any reasonable architect would recommend building in the valley or choosing a different site entirely. Ferdinand selects the hilltop specifically because it's difficult. He wants his chateau visible for miles. Wants approaching visitors to see it growing larger as they ascend, experiencing the journey as deliberate revelation rather than sudden arrival. Wants the house to command landscape rather than nestle within it. This isn't practical thinking. It's theatrical thinking. For his architect, Ferdinand selects Gabriel Hippolyte d'Estailleur, a Frenchman who spent his career studying and restoring genuine Renaissance chateaux in the Loire Valley. D'Estailleur doesn't design from imagination. He replicates authentic architectural elements from Chambord, Blois, Maintenon, creating what amounts to a scholarly reconstruction of French chateau architecture transplanted to England. The choice is deliberate. Ferdinand wants his house to look more authentically French than anything English aristocracy possesses. He's out-authenticating the authentic, proving that money plus knowledge can replicate heritage with precision that bloodlines alone don't guarantee. But building on Lodge Hill requires engineering that borders on folly. The hilltop must be leveled. Tens of thousands of cubic yards of earth move before foundation work begins. A private road must be carved from valley floor to summit, engineered to handle loaded wagons climbing at grades that would normally be considered impossible. Water must be piped from springs nearly 2 miles away, requiring infrastructure that resembles municipal engineering more than private residence construction. The project begins in 1874. It will take 15 years to complete. At peak construction, approximately 400 workers labor on Waddesdon's transformation from bare hilltop to French Renaissance fantasy. Their names mostly don't survive in popular histories. What survives? Payroll records documenting weekly wages, employment rosters listing job categories, occasional newspaper accounts mentioning the works at Baron Rothschild's estate without naming individuals performing the work. But those 400 workers represented something unprecedented in Victorian England, an industrial-scale construction operation organized with precision that reflected Ferdinand's banking family background. Stonemasons working with Bath stone, cream-colored limestone quarried from Somerset and transported by rail, then hauled up the newly carved access road in wagons, whose axles frequently broke under the load. The stone arrives in massive blocks that must be carved on site according to d'Estailleur's precise architectural drawings. The masons earn approximately 30 to 40 shillings weekly. Good wages for skilled labor, but only when work is available. Construction pauses each winter when freezing temperatures make masonry work impossible. No work means no wages. No wages means families struggling through months that test how much hardship humans can endure before breaking. Carpenters installing French oak paneling imported from forests whose specific grain patterns Ferdinand personally approved. Each panel must be fitted with tolerances tight enough to prevent visible gaps, creating illusion that walls are seamless rather than assembled. Plasterers working overhead for hours, creating ceiling details that photographs will capture, but visitors rarely examine closely. Their shoulders and necks develop chronic problems from the posture required, injuries that will cripple them decades before natural retirement age. Laborers moving earth, hauling materials, performing the muscle work that makes skilled craftsmanship possible. They earn approximately 15 to 20 shillings weekly, barely enough to support families even when work is steady. At least 3 workers die during construction. A carpenter, 36 years old, falls from scaffolding while installing roof timbers. He lands on stone courtyard, sustaining injuries that kill him within hours. No family found in employment records. Burial at local parish expense. A stonemason's assistant, 23, crushed when a bathstone block slips from rigging during installation. The block weighs nearly 3 tons. Death is immediate. He leaves behind a wife and infant daughter. A laborer, 41, dies from injuries sustained when a loaded wagon overturns on the access road, pinning him beneath cargo. He survives long enough for a doctor to arrive. Ferdinand pays for medical attention, more concerned about potential liability than genuine compassion, and dies without regaining consciousness. These deaths generate minimal newspaper coverage. They're construction accidents, routine tragedies of Victorian industrial work, occurring before safety regulations or workers' compensation existed. Ferdinand's estate pays nominal amounts to families, enough to prevent lawsuits, not enough to meaningfully support dependents. The bathstone in Waddesdon's walls contains, quite literally, the blood of men who died installing it. The oak paneling was fitted by carpenters, whose hands would never fully heal from repetitive injury. The plastered ceilings were created by workers whose bodies aged prematurely from labor, that photographs present as effortless elegance. Every palace contains 2 structures, the visible one appearing in images, and the invisible one constructed from human cost. The work continues for 15 years. The completed Waddesdon Manor contains approximately 60 rooms across multiple floors, with architecture that announces French Renaissance authenticity at every turn. But step past those showpiece spaces and another structure appears, the operational infrastructure required to maintain the fantasy. The basement extends like hidden city beneath visible grandeur. Kitchens operating at industrial scale, with ranges requiring constant coal feeding. Refrigeration rooms lined with zinc to preserve food before modern cooling technology. Storage areas holding supplies purchased in bulk because the house sits miles from any market. Servants' halls where staff eat meals separate from family and guests, reinforcing hierarchies that must never blur. Service corridors allowing movement between floors without staff appearing in public spaces. Narrow staircases deliberately kept unadorned. No decoration, minimal lighting, spaces designed purely for function. Boiler rooms where coal arrives by the ton, shoveled by hand into furnaces that heat radiators throughout 60 rooms. A single cold night could burst pipes throughout the mansion, causing damage costing thousands to repair. A power plant generating electricity for lighting systems that were cutting-edge technology in the 1880s. The machinery requires constant monitoring. One component failure could leave the entire house dark. Water systems fed by those pipes, running 2 miles from springs, with pressure maintained through tanks and distribution networks that require regular maintenance and eventual replacement as components wear. Laundries processing linens by the hundreds, tablecloths, napkins, sheets, towels, using equipment that makes work slightly less brutal than hand washing, but still requires labor in steam-filled rooms where temperatures exceed 90 degrees year-round. This parallel architecture was designed to remain invisible. The staff who make Waddesdon function don't appear in photographs of parties and gatherings. They're not mentioned in newspaper society coverage, describing weekend guests and elaborate dinners. They exist in payroll ledgers and employment records, documented with impersonal precision that treats them as operational costs rather than humans. At full operation, Waddesdon employs approximately 40 to 50 permanent staff, housemaids earning 12 to 20 pounds annually, roughly 5 to 8 shillings weekly, responsible for cleaning rooms that must remain perpetually pristine. Not just clean, but museum quality, because Ferdinand's collections require protection from dust that could damage porcelain or degrade paintings. Footmen at 25 to 35 pounds annually, trained in service choreography so precise it resembles military drill. How to announce guests with proper emphasis. How to serve meals without being noticed. How to move through rooms as if invisible until needed. Cooks commanding slightly higher wages, 40 to 60 pounds annually, operating kitchens that must produce meals for weekend parties, hosting 30 to 40 guests, plus staff meals for 50 people. gardeners maintaining grounds that require horticultural expertise rivaling botanical gardens. Ferdinand imports exotic plants from across Europe and Asia, each requiring specific soil conditions, watering schedules, protection from English climate that's often hostile to foreign species. Stable hands caring for horses and carriages that transport guests from the railway station at Aylesbury, 6 miles away, to the hilltop estate. The journey requires vehicles and animals maintained to standards that reflect on the house's quality, plus specialized positions. Ferdinand's personal valet, ladies' maids for female guests, night watchmen protecting collections worth hundreds of thousands, a secretary managing correspondence and social arrangements, a librarian cataloging Ferdinand's massive book collection. Total annual staff costs, approximately £2,000 to £2,500 when the average English worker earns roughly £50 to £75 yearly. The mansion consumes in staff wages alone what 30 to 40 working families earn in total annual income. Add operational costs, coal, food, maintenance, replacements, insurance, property taxes, and Waddesdon requires approximately £5,000 to £7,000 annually just to keep functioning. Ferdinand's income from Rothschild banking interests and investments generates this casually. But the mathematics reveal something crucial. Waddesdon exists in an economic realm completely disconnected from the lives of people who maintain it. The housemaid cleaning Ferdinand's bedroom earns in a year what he might spend on a single piece of porcelain. The footman serving dinner earns annually what Ferdinand pays for weekend catering. The gardener tending exotic plants earns what Ferdinand drops on travel expenses for a month-long European collecting tour. This isn't incidental inequality. It's structural. The entire system depends on maintaining vast economic distance between those who own and those who serve, with the distance necessary for the fantasy to function. The moment staff start being seen as humans with comparable worth, the illusion cracks. By the late 1880s, Waddesdon has achieved its primary purpose, forcing English aristocracy to visit a Rothschild chateau and acknowledge the family's sophisticated taste. Ferdinand's weekend house parties become legendary, carefully orchestrated productions where banking meets nobility, where politicians encounter industrialists, where social climbing disguises itself as elegant entertainment. The guest lists read like condensed who's who of British power. The Prince of Wales, future Edward VII, visits multiple times, sleeping in guest rooms prepared specifically for royal standards, smoking cigars in Ferdinand's library, hunting on the estate's grounds. His presence provides ultimate validation. If the heir to the throne accepts Rothschild hospitality, what English aristocrat can afford to decline? Prime ministers, cabinet members, diplomats whose conversations shape policy affecting millions. Ferdinand's dinner table becomes neutral ground where political rivals can meet unofficially, where deals get outlined before ever reaching Parliament, where the Rothschild banking network's influence operates through hospitality rather than explicit negotiation. Artists, writers, intellectuals, whose presence adds cultural legitimacy to gatherings that might otherwise seem purely about power and money. A typical weekend follows precise choreography. Guests arrive Friday evening via carriages meeting trains at Aylesbury Station. The 6-mile journey up the access road provides exactly the theatrical revelation Ferdinand designed, the chateau growing larger as vehicles climb, its illuminated windows visible for miles, announcing that something extraordinary awaits. Reception in the entrance hall where Ferdinand greets each guest personally. Not merely polite hosting, but strategic positioning, making eye contact, remembering personal details, demonstrating that despite his vast wealth, he remains attentive to individual relationships. Dinner Friday night, multiple courses served by footmen, trained to move synchronistically, with wine selections demonstrating Ferdinand's cellar rivals any in England. Conversation flows around topics Ferdinand has subtly seeded: art acquisitions, political developments, social gossip that everyone pretends not to enjoy but eagerly consumes. Saturday morning, tours of the collections for those interested, estate activities for others. Riding, shooting, walking the gardens. Options that allow guests to self-sort by interest while keeping everyone occupied. Saturday afternoon, more informal gatherings in various sitting rooms, with Ferdinand available for private conversations that might address the real reasons guests accepted invitations. Financial advice, political connections, introductions to other Rothschilds across Europe who can facilitate business deals. Saturday evening, the main event. Elaborate dinner, entertainment, musicians, sometimes theatrical performances, followed by cigars and port for men, while women gather separately for their own rituals. Sunday, late breakfast, final conversations, carriages departing by early afternoon. The entire production costs approximately £200 to £300 per weekend, roughly 4 to 6 times what Waddesdon's housemaids earn annually, but Ferdinand considers it investment rather than expense. Each weekend strengthens relationships, demonstrates sophistication, normalizes Rothschild presence among people who might otherwise maintain social distance from a Jewish banking family. But underneath the elegant surface, something else operates. The parties are performances. Ferdinand is always performing. The cultivated host, the sophisticated collector, the man whose taste justifies his wealth. His guests are performing. The impressed visitor, the grateful beneficiary of hospitality, the friend rather than someone attending because declining a Rothschild invitation could affect their political or financial interests. The staff are performing, the invisible servants, the perfectly coordinated service, the humans who function as components in machinery designed to create illusion of effortless superiority. And everyone pretends this is natural, normal, the way cultivated people have always gathered. But it isn't natural. It's engineered. Every detail calculated to prove that a Rothschild belongs among England's elite, that Jewish banking wealth deserves equal respect with inherited aristocratic titles, that outsiders can purchase acceptance if they build convincing enough facades. For approximately 20 years, this machinery functions smoothly. Then the mathematics begin shifting. December 1898. Ferdinand dies at Waddesdon, age 59, from complications following a brief illness. He never remarried after Evelina's death 33 years earlier. Never had children. Spent 3 decades building collections, hosting parties, proving his family's sophistication, and ultimately dies alone, except for staff maintaining his palace. His will bequeaths Waddesdon to his sister Alice, herself never married, herself living a life organized around collections and social positioning rather than family creation. Alice inherits not just property, but responsibility for maintaining the performance. Waddesdon can't be allowed to decline, can't signal that Rothschild commitment to English society is weakening. She continues the weekend parties with slight modifications. Fewer political gatherings, more emphasis on arts and culture, but fundamentally the same machinery producing the same illusions. But maintaining Waddesdon grows progressively expensive as the 20th century advances. Staff wages rise under pressure from labor movements that Ferdinand never had to seriously accommodate. Insurance costs increase as collections expand and become more valuable. Maintenance reveals that even stone and slate require constant attention, roofs leak, foundations shift, systems degrade regardless of original quality. Property taxes rise as government seeks revenue from large estates that seem increasingly anachronistic in democratizing England. By 1910, Waddesdon's annual operational costs have climbed to approximately £8,000 to £10,000, still manageable for Rothschild wealth, but representing a larger percentage of income than during Ferdinand's era. The First World War brings the first serious disruption. Male staff leave for military service. Replacements are difficult to find as war industries pay better wages and offer advancement opportunities domestic service never provided. The elaborate weekend parties cease, entertaining feels inappropriate, while millions die in trenches. and many potential guests are serving or grieving. Waddesdon becomes partially shuttered during wartime, with Alice maintaining only essential staff and living in a handful of rooms while vast sections stand empty. The war costs England approximately 750,000 dead, with economic devastation that will take decades to repair. When peace finally arrives in 1918, the social world that Waddesdon was built to navigate has fundamentally changed. Aristocratic fortunes have been destroyed by death duties and economic disruption. Political power shifts toward elected government and away from the landed elite that Ferdinand had worked so hard to join. The elaborate social choreography of country house weekends feels increasingly outdated as England confronts post-war realities. Alice dies in 1922, age 76, having maintained Waddesdon through war and its aftermath. She bequeaths the estate to her great-nephew James de Rothschild, another generation, another attempt to sustain Ferdinand's legacy. But the mathematics are becoming unsustainable. James inherits Waddesdon in 1922, along with an impossible mandate: maintain a French Renaissance chateau and its collections in an England that is increasingly hostile to such displays of wealth. Post-war Britain faces massive economic challenges: unemployment, inflation, social unrest that makes wealthy families nervous about advertising their fortunes too publicly. The Labour Party's growing power signals that taxes on large estates will increase, that inheritance duties will make passing such properties to future generations progressively difficult. James attempts to sustain Waddesdon's traditional functions, but the context has shifted. The weekend house parties continue, but guests increasingly come for the art collections rather than social positioning. Waddesdon becomes more museum than social headquarters, with scholars and collectors visiting to examine Ferdinand's acquisitions rather than politicians gathering to conduct unofficial business. Staff numbers decline gradually, not through dramatic cuts, but through positions that aren't filled when workers leave. A household that once employed 50 operates with 35, then 30, then 25. Service becomes less elaborate. Maintenance becomes more reactive than preventive. The gardens require constant attention that's increasingly expensive. Many exotic plants die during harsh winters without staff resources to protect them adequately. Sections of the grounds begin showing neglect, not obvious to casual visitors, but visible to anyone who knew Waddesdon during Ferdinand's era. By the 1930s, James faces a decision that Ferdinand never anticipated. The collections have become more valuable than the house containing them. Individual pieces fetch prices at auction that exceed Waddesdon's entire annual operational costs. Maintaining everything in one location makes less economic sense than it did when Ferdinand assembled his treasures. But selling feels like betrayal. Ferdinand didn't build Waddesdon merely to house collections. He built it to prove Rothschilds belonged. Dismantling that proof signals failure. Then, in 1939, war returns. September 1939. Germany invades Poland, and Britain declares war. Within weeks, officials from London's National Gallery contact James with an unusual request. Could Waddesdon's basement strongrooms store paintings evacuated from London museums vulnerable to German bombing? James agrees immediately. Suddenly, the chateau built to prove a Jewish banking family as sophisticated, taste becomes protector of British national heritage. Rembrandt, Gainsborough, Constable, Reynolds, masterworks packed in crates and transported to Buckinghamshire under armed guard, hidden in the same basement spaces that once stored wine and coal. The irony is profound. A family that spent generations proving they deserved acceptance now safeguards the art that defines English cultural identity. The outsiders become custodians of heritage that insiders couldn't protect. But the wartime transformation goes deeper. Most of Waddesdon's remaining staff leave for military service or war industries. The house operates with skeleton crews, perhaps 10 to 15 people, maintaining what 50 once handled. Vast sections are simply closed, dust sheets covering furniture that won't be used again for years. The elaborate social machinery Ferdinand engineered grinds to halt. No weekend parties, no guests, no performances proving sophistication. Just a mostly empty chateau protecting art from bombs that fall on London, while the Rothschild family who built it confronts the reality that acceptance remains conditional. Because even as Waddesdon protects British heritage, the family understands, if Germany invades England, a possibility that seems terrifyingly real during 1941, being Rothschild won't protect them. Hitler's regime has made clear what happens to Jewish families, regardless of their wealth or cultural contributions. The gas chambers don't distinguish between Frankfurt bankers and Warsaw shopkeepers. Ferdinand built Waddesdon to prove his family belonged, that wealth could purchase safety through acceptance. But in 1940, with German bombers over England and Nazi ideology threatening European Jewry, the chateau reveals its limitation. No palace offers permanent protection. No amount of Bath stone and Renaissance details can guarantee security. No collection of porcelain and paintings can prevent the machinery of hatred from grinding forward. The house that was supposed to be fortress becomes instead a reminder that fortresses eventually fail. May 1945. War ends in Europe, and gradually the paintings return to London museums. James survives the war. He served in British military throughout, demonstrating loyalty that his great-uncle Ferdinand would have recognized as another form of proving worth. But post-war England offers no easy return to pre-war social arrangements. The Labour government elected in 1945 immediately implements policies designed to redistribute wealth and dismantle aristocratic privilege. Death duties on large estates rise to punishing levels, up to 80% in some cases, making it nearly impossible to pass properties like Waddesdon to future generations without selling portions to pay taxes. Country houses across England face identical crises. Hundreds will be demolished during the 1950s and 1960s, their owners concluding that maintenance costs exceed any conceivable use. Others are sold to institutions, converted to schools or hospitals or government offices. Waddesdon faces the same mathematics that defeated so many others. Annual operating costs now approach £15,000 to £20,000, roughly 300 to 400 times what English workers earn yearly. Staff wages have risen under pressure from labor unions. Insurance on collections has skyrocketed. Maintenance reveals decades of deferred work during wartime. Roofs need replacing, foundations require reinforcement. Entire systems must be updated or replaced. James has wealth sufficient to maintain Waddesdon, but for what purpose? The social world it was built to navigate no longer exists. The weekend house parties where banking met nobility feel archaic in democratic post-war Britain. The elaborate performances proving Rothschild sophistication seemed pointless when the family's contributions during 2 world wars should have settled any questions about belonging. In 1957, James makes a decision that redefines Waddesdon's meaning. He bequeaths the estate to the National Trust, a preservation organization that will maintain it as public museum after his death, with the Rothschild family retaining some involvement, but fundamentally transferring ownership to the British people. The outsiders who built a palace to prove they belonged ultimately give that palace to the nation they spent generations trying to join. James dies in 1957. Waddesdon opens to the public in 1959. Stand in Waddesdon's entrance hall today, and you witness something Ferdinand could never have imagined. Ordinary people, not aristocrats, not politicians, just visitors who paid admission fees, photographing his collections, walking through his rooms, examining the porcelain and paintings he assembled to prove his sophisticated taste. The fantasy he constructed to force acceptance has become educational. Entertainment for masses he never anticipated welcoming. Annual visitors now number approximately 400,000, More people in a single year than probably passed through Waddesdon during Ferdinand's entire lifetime. They come from everywhere: England, Europe, Asia, America. People whose backgrounds would have made them unthinkable guests during the chateau's social heyday. The National Trust maintains the house with precision Ferdinand would recognize, every surface pristine, every object catalogued, every detail contributing to visitor experience. But the purpose has fundamentally shifted. No one visits to be impressed by Rothschild's social status. They visit to see beautiful objects in beautiful settings, to learn about Victorian collecting habits, to experience preserved examples of 19th century luxury. The machinery built to prove belonging now teaches history instead. But here's what the museum interpretation consistently omits: the desperation behind the beauty. The fact that Ferdinand constructed this elaborate stage because he wasn't naturally welcomed. The reality that Jewish banking families had to prove through architecture and collecting what Protestant aristocrats inherited through birth. The wall text describes Ferdinand's exquisite taste without mentioning that taste served a function beyond aesthetics. The guided tours discuss construction techniques without quantifying the human cost. The workers who died, the ones who were injured, the families supported on wages that kept them dependent. The gift shop sells reproductions and books, celebrating Waddesdon's beauty without examining why beauty was necessary, what it was defending against, and who paid the price for maintaining it. This sanitization is typical of how we remember Gilded Age estates. We preserve the beautiful surfaces while forgetting the uncomfortable mechanics. We need to acknowledge something the National Trust brochures consistently exclude: the people who made Waddesdon function for 3 generations. Their names mostly don't appear in the history. They exist in employment records and payroll ledgers, documented as operational costs rather than humans with their own stories. What happened to the housemaid who cleaned Ferdinand's rooms for 30 years? Did she retire with pension, or was she dismissed when age made her slower? Did she ever afford to own property, or did she die in rented rooms after decades, serving someone who owned a French chateau? What happened to the footman who served dinner to the Prince of Wales and countless other notables? Did that proximity to power ever translate into opportunities for his own family, or did he remain trapped in service work that paid survival wages but offered no advancement? What happened to the gardeners who maintained exotic plants through English winters, who developed knowledge rivaling professional horticulturalists but received none of the recognition? Were their skills valued anywhere else, or were they tied permanently to estates like Waddesdon because their expertise had no market beyond wealthy collectors? These workers gave decades to maintaining fantasies that served them not at all, except through paychecks that were generous by working-class standards, but absurd compared to the wealth they enabled. They were the invisible infrastructure, present but unacknowledged, necessary but not valued. Human costs excluded from histories that celebrate Ferdinand's sophisticated taste and architectural achievement. And there's another category of invisibility: the Jewish identity that Ferdinand simultaneously carried and minimized. He built Waddesdon partly because being Rothschild and Jewish meant not naturally belonging among English aristocracy. But he couldn't build a Jewish palace that would only reinforce difference rather than prove similarity. So Waddesdon became a French Renaissance chateau, architecturally Christian in its references, designed to suggest Ferdinand shared cultural heritage with the Protestant elite who spent centuries excluding his family from property ownership and political participation. He had to hide his Jewishness while using Rothschild wealth to prove worth. That paradox, needing to succeed as Rothschild while downplaying what made him Rothschild, defines the assimilation bargain that wealthy Jewish families negotiated throughout the 19th century. Build beautiful enough facades, collect prestigious enough art, host elegant enough parties, and maybe, you'll be accepted despite carrying an identity that's marked for persecution across European history. Waddesdon represents that bargain made visible in Bathstone and Renaissance architecture. Stand today at the base of Lodge Hill and look up at Waddesdon Manor glowing against the sky. Beautiful, undeniably. The cream-colored stone catches afternoon light exactly as Ferdinand intended. The French Renaissance details announce sophisticated taste. The surrounding grounds suggest permanence and belonging that transcends individual lifetimes. But the beauty conceals uncomfortable truths. This wasn't built from confidence. It was built from desperation, disguised as confidence. Ferdinand constructed an elaborate stage to perform belonging, because actual belonging was denied to him through circumstances of birth. The mansion that looks like ultimate security was actually evidence of insecurity so profound it required spending a fortune over 15 years to address. And ultimately, it didn't work, not the way Ferdinand hoped. Yes, the Prince of Wales visited. Yes, politicians and aristocrats accepted invitations. Yes, the Rothschilds achieved social recognition that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. But that recognition remained conditional. When war returned and Hitler's regime made Jewish identity grounds for extermination, Ferdinand's sophisticated taste and French chateau offered no protection. Being culturally indistinguishable from Protestant elite didn't prevent being targeted for persecution. The outsiders could build insider palaces, but they remained outsiders nonetheless. What does survive, what the national trust preserves, isn't actually what Ferdinand intended. He wanted Waddesdon to prove Rothschilds belonged among England's elite. Instead, it now teaches tourists about Victorian collecting habits and preservation techniques. He wanted the chateau to force aristocratic acceptance. Instead, it's become democratic museum where ordinary people pay admission to see how the wealthy once lived. He wanted permanence and security. Instead, he created a monument to the impossibility of purchasing permanent acceptance through architectural grandeur. The bargain he struck, build convincing enough facades, and maybe you'll be safe, failed not because the facade wasn't convincing, but because the premise was flawed. No palace guarantees security. No collection of porcelain prevents persecution. No amount of sophisticated taste transforms outsiders into insiders if the boundary is drawn using criteria that wealth can't cross. Ferdinand de Rothschild spent 3 decades and a fortune building Waddesdon. What he actually built was evidence that some problems can't be solved through architecture, no matter how beautiful the solution appears. In the basement strong rooms at Waddesdon, the same spaces that once stored Ferdinand's wine and now occasionally housed traveling exhibitions, there's still evidence of 1940. Faint marks on walls where crates containing Rembrandt and Gainsborough rested during the Blitz. Barely visible traces of the temporary shelving that protected British national heritage when London museums couldn't. The National Trust doesn't highlight this during standard tours. It's not part of the carefully curated story they tell about Ferdinand's sophisticated taste and architectural achievement. But the marks remain. Evidence that when crisis arrived, the palace built to prove outsiders could belong became instead a fortress protecting insider culture that had spent generations excluding the family who built it. The irony is almost too perfect. Rothschilds safeguarding British heritage that defines identity they were never fully allowed to share. Ferdinand would have understood that irony. He'd have recognized it as another variation of the perpetual performance, always proving worth, always demonstrating value, always working to justify existence that should never have required justification. Waddesdon Manor still stands. Beautiful, preserved, educational. But it remembers what the museum interpretation excludes. The desperate calculations behind the beauty, the human costs concealed beneath elegant surfaces, and the fundamental failure of the premise that acceptance could be purchased through architecture. The walls remember. Even if we choose to forget,